There's a question in narcissistic healing that sounds simple, but most people get wrong. Can a narcissist change? The answer you hear are always the same. Yes, no, maybe. Sometimes people say it depends on the person. Sometimes they say change is possible if they really want to. Sometimes they say narcissists can never change and you should just leave. None of these answers are correct, and the reason they get it wrong is because it answers the wrong question entirely. The real question is not whether a narcissist can change. The question is, what kind of change are we actually talking about? Because in the world of cluster B personality disorders like narcissism, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, there are three different outcomes that look identical from the outside but are nothing alike. And understanding the difference between them is not just clinically interesting, it's the difference between spending years believing you're healing when you're actually just performing or finally finding a path that leads somewhere real. Sam Vaknin, a professor of psychology, makes a delineation that in cluster B disorders, healing and behavior modification are not two ends of the same spectrum. They are not different degrees of the same thing. They are completely dissociated. They operate on separate tracks, and you cannot accomplish both. That's what this episode is about. Healing, as Vaknin defines it, requires two things to happen simultaneously. First, the clinical profile changes using standardized psychological assessments and structured diagnostic interviews. The person no longer qualifies for the personality disorder diagnosis. Second, the internal psychodynamics shift. The processes inside that give rise to their emotions, cognitions, and moods are fundamentally different. Both of these must occur together. Either one alone is not healing. In a psychologically healthy person, these two elements are connected. When someone's internal landscape changes through therapy, through self-reflection, through any meaningful internal shift, their behavior changes in response. The inside informs the outside. There's a mirror. What you see in a person's conduct is a reflection of what's happening inside. This connection is broken in cluster B personality disorders. In cluster B, you cannot assume that changing the inside changes the outside. And you cannot assume that changing the outside changes the inside. They do not inform each other. They are separated by a dissociation, which is a fundamental schism between the internal world and the observable behavior. This has a profound implication. It means that the person with a cluster B disorder can lose their diagnosis, their clinical profile can improve to the point where they no longer meet the criteria for the diagnosis, and their behaviors can remain completely unchanged. The internal work happened, the diagnosis went away, and the person is still behaving in the same destructive patterns. This also means the reverse. Someone can learn to behave very differently, to appear cooperative, thoughtful, and controlled without any internal shift having occurred at all. The outside changed, the inside stayed the same. In longitudinal studies tracking patients with borderline personality disorder over decades show that a significant portion of patients by their 40s and 50s no longer meet the diagnostic criteria. The diagnosis falls away, and yet, Patney points out, these same individuals retain the dysfunctional behaviors associated with the disorder. The promiscuity, the recklessness, the aggression, it doesn't follow the diagnosis out the door. So think about what that means. A person can be clinically measurably better and still be destructive. A person's behavior can be socially acceptable and their internal world still pathological. From the outside, you cannot tell which version you're looking at. This is why the question, can a narcissist change, is the wrong question. The question is, change in what direction, by what mechanism, producing what outcome? Because there are three different outcomes here, and they conflate them. Conflating them has a real cost. So why does this dissociation happen? Why can't the inside and outside move together in cluster B disorders? Vaknin identifies three mechanisms that keep the internal world and external behavior locked apart. The first mechanism is dissociative self-states. Cluster B personality disorders are post-traumatic conditions. They arise from early childhood environments where the child's boundaries were violated, where separation and individuation were prevented, where the child was instrumentalized, objectified, or pedestalized rather than seen. The child who grows up in this environment doesn't integrate, they fragment. What develops is a collection of pseudo-identities. Pseudo-identities are aspects of personality, each organized around a different self-state, each separated from the others by a wall of dissociation. This is not a full-blown dissociative identity disorder, but it borrows the same architecture. When the person is exposed to a stressor like abandonment, rejection, or humiliation, a different self-state takes over. A different version of them emerges and runs the show. The consequences for change is severe. When therapy works on the internal connection of these self-states, when it changes how they interact or even integrates them into a more cohesive whole, the dissociation remains. The wall stays up, and that wall prevents the internal change from filtering through to the outside. So, what does that mean? You can do the profound internal work, you can feel different, you can think differently, and your behavior stays exactly the same because the part of you that behaves was never connected to the part that changed. The second mechanism is external locus of control, which is the outsourcing of ego functions. People with cluster B disorders don't regulate themselves from the outside. Their internal world is either self-sufficient and closed off from reality, as in narcissism, or totally dysregulated and dependent on others, as in borderline personality disorder. Either way, they are not running their own internal operations. Those functions are imported from outside. Behaviors in this model are not determined by internal insight, conviction, or identity. They are reactive. They are provoked by the environment. They are determined by other people, by social feedback, by what's happening around the person right now. This is why Vaknin says the narcissist interacts with internal objects, not external people. What the narcissist relates to is an internalized representation of someone, an introject, not the actual person standing in front of them. This is called an introject that the narcissist snapshots. And because behaviors are externally driven, changing the person's internal world has no bearing on what they do. The outside determines behavior, not the inside. The third mechanism is the rich fantasy life that substitutes for reality. Cluster B individuals develop an elaborate internal fantasy world as a primary coping strategy. This is not daydreaming, it's a progressive retreat from reality. The person gives up on the world, gives up on actual relationships, and begins to live inside an internalized paracosm, where all the important interactions take place. Fantasy becomes the dominant mode of existence. The consequences for reality testing are devastating. When a person's primary psychological operations happen inside a fantasy world, their behaviors in the real world become scripted by that fantasy rather than by actual circumstances. Behaviors become incomprehensible to others because they're not connected to what's actually happening. They're connected to an internal narrative the outside world has no access to. The person's scripts come from imitation, from social mores, from feedback they received, not from a stable self that has a continuous relationship with reality. And that means behavior can be modified by changing the social environment, but it cannot be stabilized by internal conviction because there is no continuous internal self to anchor it. These three mechanisms, dissociative self states, external locus of control, and fantasy driven reality substitution, all converge on one core problem that Backlund identifies as foundational: identity disturbance. People with cluster B personality disorders do not have a core identity in a way healthy people do. What they have is a shape-shifting, kaleidoscopic landscape of self-states, each trying to substitute for a genuine identity and each failing because of the dissociation between them. Identity depends on continuous memory. Your sense of who you are is built from the continuity of your experience over time. When those memories are disrupted by dissociation, when the self states don't share a common autobiographical record, identity cannot form. There's no stable self. There's no continuous I that persists from one context to the next. And if there's no stable identity, there's no stable self to drive consistent behavior. In the absence of identity, behaviors are essentially random. They're dictated by whatever is happening in the environment, not rather by imitation, by feedback. If the feedback is wrong, the behavior is wrong. The person is not in control of who they are or what they do. This is the architecture that makes cluster B personality disorder so resistant to change. You're not trying to modify the behavior of a person with a stable self. You're trying to change the behavior of someone whose self is fragmented, whose internal world is cut off from their external actions, and whose behaviors are being generated by an internalized fantasy world rather than by contact with reality. This is why if you have narcissistic traits and you've been trying to change by trying harder, by white knuckling better behavior, by forcing yourself to be more careful, more controlled, more considerate, it keeps not working. You're trying to use the executive function of a self that doesn't fully exist. The harder you push from the outside, the more the inside fractures. So what are the actual outcomes? Backlund describes three, though only two are fully within the scope of this framework. The first outcome is spontaneous internal remission and persistent external dysfunction. With overt grandiose narcissists, there is evidence that internal psychodynamics do improve with age. The grandiose presentation softens, the abrasive edges file down. The person becomes easier to be around and socially acceptable, less threatening. By middle age, some individuals who would have met the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder no longer do. Backlund argues the behaviors persist, the internal environment smooths out while the external patterns remain the same. This is internal healing without behavioral change, and it does not look like recovery from the outside. There's an important caveat. Covert narcissists may follow a different course. Some evidence suggests that covert narcissists do not experience the same spontaneous remission with age. Their psychodynamics may remain more stable over the lifespan. The second outcome is behavior modification without internal healing. This is what most therapy produces for people with cluster B disorders. The person's external conduct changes. They learn different ways of relating. They develop better impulse control, better social skills, better coping mechanisms. They may enter stable relationships, maintain employment, function well enough in the world. But the internal structure, the dissociative self states, the external locus of control, the fantasy-driven relationship with reality remains intact. The person has learned to perform a more functional version of themselves. Vectin characterizes this as the person essentially acting their way through life, executing socially acceptable scripts without the internal coherence that would make the performance genuine. This is not nothing. Reduced harm is valuable. Better behavior protects the people around the person, even if the internal pathology hasn't shifted. And Vectin acknowledges that behavior modification is possible and worthwhile even without healing. But it's not healing. And conflating the two has real costs for the person doing the work and for the people around them. The third outcome, the one that we need to have an honest look at, is neither. The default without sustained intervention is persistent dysfunction. Neither the internal world changes nor the external behavior changes. The person cycles through the same patterns, the same relational failures, the same occupational instability year after year. Bakhtin describes how this trajectory leads towards something like learned helplessness. The person who beneath the braggadocio has given up on ever actually getting what they want from the world because every attempt has failed. This is not meant to be discouraging. It's meant to be accurate. And accuracy is what allows you to stop spending your energy on strategies that can't work and start looking at what actually can. Here's what this means for you. If you're watching this because you have narcissistic traits and you want something real to change, or if you know someone who does have narcissism, it means that before you can assess whether you're making progress, you need to know what you're aiming for. Are you working toward internal healing, a genuine shift in your psychodynamics, a more integrated self, a more continuous relationship with reality? Or are you working toward behavior modification, better conduct, reduced harm, more functional relationships? Both are legitimate, both, but they're not the same thing. And if you're doing one and telling yourself you're doing the other, you're in an elaborate self-deception that will eventually collapse. Vectin argues that there is no known therapy that reliably produces internal healing in narcissistic personality disorder. None, not even the therapeutic approaches that attempt it, which he acknowledges carry significant risk, like cold therapy, which involves complete mortification and dissolution of the narcissistic self-state. But this is not a defeatist conclusion that it might seem. It is a clarification. If internal healing is the goal, you need to know what you're actually signing up for, a rare, difficult, uncertain process with no guarantees. If behavior modification is the goal, you can approach it more honestly. A learnable set of skills, a reduction in harm you cause, a more functional life without mistaking any of it for a cure. This is also where OLNE's framework enters the picture and where it offers something that most treatment approaches don't. In the book OLNE, the relationship philosophy developed by Ron John is built around 4 principles: open communication, non-conditional love, non-judgmental acceptance, and co-independence. These are not therapeutic interventions aimed at internal pathology of narcissism. They are relational structures designed for how people actually interact with each other. And that distinction is very important because if the core problem is that a person's internal world doesn't inform their external behavior, that there's a dissociation between who they are inside and what they do, then what they need is not just internal work. They need external structure. They need feedback that comes from actual contact with reality. They need relationships that function in as reality testing environments rather than just sources of supply. Co-independence, the OLNE principle that describes two whole people relating without losing themselves in each other, called fusion or merger, is in this framework not just a relationship goal. It is a corrective, it is corrective to the external locus of control. It is a structure that requires genuine internal presence rather than performance. Non-judgmental acceptance is another principle, accepting yourself and others as you are, as they are, without the moralism that keeps the false self armored, is a corrective to the shame and reactance that keeps the narcissist locked in their defensive patterns. And open communication, saying what you actually mean without the strategic manipulation that characterizes the narcissist's relational style, is a corrective to the fantasy substituted reality that generates incomprehensible behavior. Hence the title of the album, Final Shared Fantasy. These are not cures for narcissism, but they are structures that create conditions where something real has a chance to develop. The question this episode leaves you with is honest, and it's one you have to answer for yourself. Which of the three outcomes are you actually working toward? If you're trying to perform a better version of yourself and calling that healing, you need to know that, because the people around you will eventually know. The dissociation doesn't hide anything forever. If you're doing genuine internal work like therapy, self-confrontation, the slow and terrifying process of building continuous identity where there wasn't one, you need to know that this is possible but rare, and that the progress will show up the way you expect it to, or will not show up the way you expect it to. It'll show up as internal coherence, not external perfection. And if you're not sure, if you've been assuming that trying harder would eventually get you there, this episode is an invitation to ask the question more precisely. In episode 3, the next episode, we'll go deeper into why the false self is specifically the obstacle to all three outcomes, not just healing, but modification and performance too. Because the false self doesn't just block change, it blocks your ability to even accurately assess which of the three you're actually doing. Completely. Let's talk about that on the next episode. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching, and enjoy this track from the album Final Shared Fantasy. Bye-bye.
We built it in smoke, in the same small room. You looked right through me and called it truth. I learned the shape of being almost seen, a chair at the table, a name in between. But the room was lying, I felt it awake. The air went cold when the spell would break. Leave the triangle, leave it behind. The story was the cage, truth over the fantasy. Leave the triangle, I'm choosing my life. I'm not begging to be real, I'm getting myself back. You made me small to keep the scene alive, then handed me pieces of your split line. I kept the mirror, trying to fix the glare, but it only showed me I was never there. Now I see the pattern clear as a scar. What looked like love was a crowded dark. Leave the triangle, leave story was a cage, truth over the fantasy. The prize was getting out, and I